Semyonov, an army driver, was taken prisoner at the same time as Mostovskoy and Sofia Levington. After 10 weeks in a camp near the front, he was sent with a large party of captured Red Army soldiers in the direction of the western border. During these 10 weeks, he wasn't beaten or kicked with fists, rifle butts or boots. All he suffered from was hunger. Like water, hunger is part of life. Like water, it has the power to destroy the body, to cripple the soul, to annihilate millions of lives. Hunger, ice, snowfalls, droughts, floods and epidemics can decimate flocks of sheep and herds of horses. They can kill wolves, foxes, songbirds, camels, perch and vipers. During natural disasters, people become like animals in their suffering. The state has the power to dam life up. Like water squeezed between narrow banks, hunger will then cripple, smash to pieces or exterminate a man, a tribe, or people. Molecule by molecule, hunger squeezes out the fats and proteins from each cell. Hunger softens the bones, twists the legs of children with rickets, thins the blood, stiffens the muscles, makes the head spin, gnaws at nerves. Hunger weighs down the soul, drives away joy and faith, destroys thought, and engenders submissiveness, base cruelty, indifference and despair. All that is human in a man can perish. He can turn into a savage animal that murders, commits acts of cannibalism and eats corpses. The state can construct a barrier that separates wheat and rye from the people who sowed it. The state has the power to bring about a famine as terrible as those which killed millions of people during the siege of Leningrad and in the cattle pens of Hitler's camps. Food, victuals, grub, nourishment, rations, hard tack, bread, a fry-up, something to eat, a rich diet, a meat diet, an invalid diet, a thin diet, a rich, generous spread, a refined dish. Something simple. A peasant dish, a blowout, food. Potato peelings, dogs, young frogs, snails, rotten cabbage leaves, stale beet, decayed horse meat, cat meat, the flesh of crows and jackdaws, damp rotting grain, leather from belts and shoes, glue, earth impregnated with slops from the officer's kitchen. All this is food. This is what trickles through the dam. People struggle to obtain all this. They then divide it up, exchange it and steal it from one another. On the 11th day of the journey, at Khutor, Mikhailovsky, the guards dragged the now unconscious Semyonov out of the wagon and handed him over to the station authorities. The commandant, a middle-aged German, glanced at the half-dead soldier lying by the wall and turned to his interpreter. "Let him crawl to the village. He'll be dead by tomorrow. There's no need to shoot him." Semyonov dragged himself to the village. At the first hut, he was refused entrance. "There's nothing here for you. Go away," said an old woman's voice from behind the door. No one answered when he knocked at the second hut. Either it was empty or the door was bolted on the inside. The door of the third hut was half open. He walked into the porch. No one challenged him. He went inside. He could smell the warmth. He felt dizzy and lay down on the bench by the door. Breathing heavily, he looked round at the white walls, the icons, the table and the stove. After the cattle pen of the camp, all this seemed very strange. A shadow passed by the window. A woman walked in, caught sight of Semyonov and screamed, "Who are you?" Semyonov didn't say anything. The answer was obvious enough. That day, his life and fate was decided not by the merciless forces of warring states, but by a human being, old Kristya Chunyak. She gave him a mug of milk. He drank, swallowing it greedily but with difficulty. After he finished the mug, he felt sick. He vomited over and over again. He felt he was being torn apart. He wept, sucking in each breath as though it were his last. He tried to control himself. There was only one thought in his mind. He was unclean, foul. The woman would throw him out. Through his swollen eyes, he saw her fetch a rag and start to wipe the floor. He wanted to say that he'd clear it up himself, that he'd do anything she wanted, if only she didn't throw him out, but he could only mutter incoherently and point with his trembling fingers. Time passed. The old woman went in and out of the hut several times. She still hadn't tried to throw him out. Perhaps she was asking a neighbour to call a German patrol or the Ukrainian police. She put an iron pot on the stove. The room grew hotter. Clouds of steam began to appear. The old woman's face looked hard, hostile. She's going to throw me out and then disinfect the place, he thought to himself. She took some trousers and some underwear out of a trunk. She helped Semyonov undress and made his clothes into a bundle. He could smell his filthy body and the stench of his pants. They were soaked with urine and bloody excrement. She helped him into a bathtub. He felt the strong, rough touch of her palms on his louse-eaten body. Warm, soapy water ran over his chest and shoulders. He suddenly began to choke and tremble. He felt dizzy. Whining, swallowing down snot, he howled, "Mama! Mamanka! Mamanka!" She wiped the tears from his eyes with a thick grey towel and dried his hair and shoulders. She put her hands under his armpits and lifted him onto a bench. She bent down to dry his thin, stick-like legs, slipped a shirt and some drawers over him, and did up the white cloth-covered buttons. She poured the filthy black water into a bucket and carried it away. She spread a sheepskin jacket over the stove, covered it with a piece of striped cloth, put a large pillow at one end. Then she lifted Semyonov into the air as easily as if he were a chicken, and laid him out on the stove. He lay there in semi-delirium. His body knew that an unimaginable change had taken place. The merciless world was no longer trying to destroy a tormented beast. But he had never experienced such pain, neither in the camp nor on the journey. His legs ached, his fingers ached, his bones ached. His head kept filling with some damp black sludge, and then suddenly emptying and starting to spin. There were moments when he felt a twinge of pain in his heart, when it seemed to stop beating, when his insides filled with smoke and he thought death had come for him. 4 days passed. Semyonov climbed down from the stove and began to walk about the room. He was amazed how much food there was in the world. In the camp there had been nothing but rotten beet. He had forgotten that there were other foods than that thin, cloudy, putrid-smelling soup, and now he could see millet, potatoes, cabbage, lard. He could hear a cock crow. He was like a child who thought that the world was ruled by 2 magicians, one good and the other evil. He couldn't rid himself of the fear that the evil magician might once again overpower the good magician, that the kind, warm world would vanish with all its food, that he'd again be left to chew at his leather belt. He busied himself with trying to repair a small hand mill. He was appallingly inefficient. His forehead would be dripping with sweat after he'd ground a mere handful of damp grey flour. He cleaned the drive with a file and some sandpaper, and then tightened the bolt between the mechanism and the grindstones. He did everything that could be expected of an intelligent mechanic from Moscow. At the end of his labours, the mill worked worse than ever. He lay down on the stove, trying to work out how best to grind wheat. In the morning he took the mill to pieces again and rebuilt it using some cogs from an old grandfather clock. "Look, Aunt Krista," he boasted, showing her the double train of gears he had contrived. They spoke to each other very little. She never mentioned her husband, who had died in 1930, her sons who had disappeared without trace, or her daughter, who had moved to Priluki and quite forgotten her. Nor did she ask him how he had been taken prisoner, or where he was from, the city or the country. He didn't dare go out onto the street. He'd always look long and carefully through the window before going out into the yard, and then hurry back inside. If the door slammed, or a mug fell to the floor, he took fright. It seemed as though everything good would come to an end, as though the magic of old Christia Chunyak would lose its power. Whenever a neighbour came in, he climbed up onto the stove and tried not to breathe too loudly or sneeze. But the neighbours very seldom called round. As for the Germans, they never stayed long in the village. Their billets were in the settlement by the station. Semyonov didn't feel any guilt at the thought that he was enjoying warmth and peace while the war raged on around him. What he did feel was fear. Fear that he might be dragged back into the world of the camps, the world of hunger. He always hesitated before opening his eyes in the morning. The magic might have run out during the night. He might see camp guards and barbed wire. He might hear the clang of empty tins. He'd listened for a while, with his eyes closed, checking that Christia was still there. He seldom thought about the recent past, about Commissar Krimov, Stalingrad, the camp, or the train journey. But every night he cried out and shouted in his sleep. Once he even climbed down from the stove, crawled along the floor, squeezed under the bench, and slept there till morning. He was unable to remember what it was he had dreamed. Sometimes he saw trucks drive down the village street with potatoes and sacks of grain, and once he saw a car, an Opel Capitan. It had a powerful engine, and the wheels didn't skid in the mud. His heart missed a beat as he imagined guttural voices in the porch and a German patrol bursting into the hut. When he asked Aunt Christia about the Germans, she answered, "Some of them aren't bad at all. When the front came this way, I had 2 of them in here. One was a student, and the other an artist. They used to play with the children. And then there was a driver. He had a cat with him. When he came back, she would run out to meet him. She must have come all the way from the frontier with him. He would sit at the table nursing her, giving her lumps of butter and bacon fat. He was very good to me. He brought me firewood. And once he got me a sack of flour. But there are other Germans who kill children. They killed the old man next door. They don't treat us like human beings. They make a filthy mess in the house and they walk around naked in front of women, and some of our own police from the village are just as bad." "There are no beasts like German beasts," said Semyonov. "But aren't you afraid to keep me here, Aunt Christia?" She shook her head and said there were lots of freed prisoners in the countryside, though of course they were mostly Ukrainians who'd come back to their own homes. But she could say Semyonov was her nephew, the son of her sister who had gone to Moscow with her husband. Semyonov knew the neighbours' faces by now. He even knew the old woman who had refused to let him in on the first day. He knew that in the evening the girls went to the cinema at the station, that every Saturday there was a dance. He wanted to know what films the Germans showed, but only the old people called round, and none of them ever went there. One neighbour showed him a letter from her daughter who had been deported to Germany. There were several passages he had to have explained to him. In one paragraph, the girl had written, "Vanka and Grishka flew in. They mended the windows." Vanya and Grisha were in the Air Force. There must have been some Soviet air raids. Later in the same letter she wrote, "It rained just like in Bakhmash." That was another way of saying the same thing. At the beginning of the war, the railway station at Bakhmash had been bombed. That evening, a tall, thin old man came to see Christia. He looked Semyonov up and down and said, with no trace of a Ukrainian accent, "Where are you from, young man?" "I was a prisoner. We're all of us prisoners now." The old man had served in the artillery under Tsar Nikolai, and he could recall the commands with astonishing accuracy. He began to rehearse them in front of Semyonov, giving the commands in Russian, in a hoarse voice, and then reporting their execution in a young, ringing voice with a Ukrainian accent. He'd obviously remembered his own voice, and that of his commanding officer, as they had sounded years ago. Then he began abusing the Germans. He told Semyonov that people had hoped they'd do away with the kolkhozes, but they must have realized that the system had its advantages for them too. They'd set up 5 hut and 10 hut cooperatives, the same old sections and brigades under another name. Kolkhozes, kolkhozes, Aunt Christia repeated mournfully. Why'd you say that? Asked Semyonov. Of course there are kolkhozes. What do you expect? Oh, you be quiet, said the old woman. Remember what you were like when you first arrived? Well, in 1930 the whole of Ukraine was like that. When there were no more nettles, we ate earth. Every last grain of corn was taken away. My man died. As for me, I couldn't walk. My whole body swelled up. I lost my voice. Semyonov was astonished that old Christia once could have starved just like he had. He had imagined hunger and death to be powerless before the mistress of the good heart. Were you kulaks? He asked. What do you mean? Everyone was dying. It was worse than the war. Are you from the country? Asked the old man. No, I was born in Moscow, and so was my father. Well, said the old man, if you had been here during collectivization, you'd have kicked the bucket in no time. You know why I stayed alive? Because I know plants. And I'm not talking about things like acorns, linden leaves, goosefoot and nettles. They all went in no time. I know 56 plants a man can eat. That's how I stayed alive. It was barely spring. There wasn't a leaf on the trees. And there was I, digging up roots. I know everything, brother. Every root, every grass, every flower, every kind of bark. Cows, sheep and horses can die of hunger, but not me. I'm more herbivorous than any of them. You're from Moscow? Said Christia very slowly. I hadn't realized you were from Moscow. The old man left, and Semyonov went to bed. Christia sat there, her head in her hands, gazing into the black night sky. There had been a fine harvest in 1930. The wheat stood like a tall, thick wall. It was taller than she was. It came right up to the shoulders of her Vasily. A low wailing hung over the village. The little children kept up a constant, barely audible whine as they crawled about like living skeletons. The men wandered aimlessly around the yards, exhausted by hunger, barely able to breathe, their feet swollen. The women went on searching for something to eat, but everything had already gone. Nettles, acorns, linden leaves, uncured sheepskins, old bones, hooves and horns that had been lying around on the ground. Meanwhile, the young men from the city went from house to house, hardly glancing at the dead and the dying, searching cellars, digging holes in barns, prodding the ground with iron bars. They were searching for the grain hidden away by the kulaks. One sultry day, Vasily Chunyak had breathed his last breath. Just then the young men from Moscow had come back to the hut. One of them, a man with blue eyes and an accent just like Semyonov's, had walked up to the corpse and said, They're an obstinate lot, these kulaks. They'd rather die than give in. Christia gave a sigh, crossed herself, and laid out on her bedding. Victor had expected his work to be appreciated by only a narrow circle of theoretical physicists. In fact, people were constantly telephoning him, and not only physicists, but also mathematicians and chemists whom he hadn't even met. Often they asked him to clarify certain points. His equations were of some complexity. Delegates from one of the student societies came to the institute to ask him to give a lecture to final year students of physics and mathematics. He gave 2 lectures at the academy itself. Markov and Savostyanov said that his work was being discussed in most of the institute's laboratories. In the special store, Lyudmila overheard an exchange between the wives of 2 scientists. Where are you in the queue? Behind Strum's wife. The Strum! Victor was by no means indifferent to this sudden fame, although he tried not to show it. The Scientific Council of the Institute decided to nominate his work for a Stalin Prize. Victor didn't attend the meeting himself, but that evening he couldn't take his eyes off the phone. He was waiting for Sokolov to say what had happened. The first person to speak to him, however, was Savostyanov. With not even a trace of his usual mockery or cynicism, Savostyanov repeated, It's a triumph, a real triumph. Academician Prasolov had said that the walls of the Institute had seen no work of such importance since the research of his late friend Lebedev on the pressure of light. Professor Svechin had talked about Victor's mathematics, showing that there was an innovative element even in his methods. He had said that it was only the Soviet people who were capable of devoting their energy so selflessly to the service of the people at a time of war. Several other men, Markov among them, had spoken, but the most striking and forceful words of all had been Gurevich's. "He's a good man," said Savostyanov. "He didn't hold back. He said what needed to be said. He called your work a classic of the same importance as that of the founders of atomic physics, Planck, Bohr, and Fermi." That's saying something, thought Victor. Sokolov phoned immediately afterwards. "It's impossible to get through to you today. The line's been engaged for the last 20 minutes. He too was excited and enthusiastic. "I forgot to ask Savostyanov how the voting went," said Victor. Sokolov explained that Professor Gavronov, a specialist in the history of physics, had voted against Victor. In his view, Victor's work lacked a true scientific foundation, was influenced by the idealist views of Western physicists, and held out no possibilities of practical application. "Well, it might even help to have Gavronov against it," said Victor. "Maybe," agreed Sokolov. Gavronov was a strange man. He was referred to in jest as the Slav Brotherhood, on account of the fanatical obstinacy with which he tried to link all the great achievements of physics to the work of Russian scientists. He ranked such little-known figures as Petrov, Umov, and Yakovlev higher than Faraday, Maxwell, and Planck. Finally, Sokolov said jokingly, "You see, Viktor Pavlovich, Moscow's recognized the importance of your work. Soon we'll be banqueting in your house." Maria Ivanovna then took the receiver from Sokolov and said, "Congratulations to both, you and Lyudmila Nikolaevna. I'm so happy for you." It's nothing," said Victor. "Vanity of vanities." Nevertheless, that vanity both excited and moved him. Later, when Lyudmila Nikolaevna was about to go to bed, Markov rang. He was always very au fait with the ins and outs of the official world, and he talked about the council in a different way from Sokolov and Savostyanov. Apparently, after Gurevich's speech, Kovchenko had made everyone laugh by saying, "They're ringing the bells in the Institute of Mathematics to celebrate Viktor Pavlovich's work. The procession round the church hasn't yet begun, but the banner's been raised." The ever-suspicious Markov had sensed a certain hostility behind this joke. As for Shishakov, he hadn't said what he thought of Victor's work. He had merely nodded his head as he listened to the speakers, perhaps in approval, perhaps as if to say, "So it's your turn now, is it?" Indeed, he even appeared to favour the work of a young Professor Molokhanov on the radiographic analysis of steel. If nothing else, his research had immediate practical applications in the few factories producing high-quality metals. After the meeting, Shishakov had gone up to Gavronov and had a word with him. When Markov finished, Victor said to him, "Vyacheslav Ivanovich, you should be in the diplomatic service." "No," replied Markov, who had no sense of humour. "I'm an experimental physicist." Victor went into Lyudmila's room. "I've been nominated for a Stalin Prize. I've just heard the news." He told her about the various speeches. "Of course, all this official recognition means nothing. Still, I've had enough of my eternal inferiority complex. You know, if I go into the conference hall and see free seats in the front row, I never go and sit there. Instead, I hide away in some distant corner, while Shishakov and Postoev go and sit on the platform without the least hesitation. I don't give a damn about the actual chair, but I do wish I could feel the right to sit in it." "How glad Tolya would have been," said Lyudmila. "Yes, and I'll never be able to tell my mother," said Victor. Lyudmila then said, "Vitya, it's already after 11. and Nadia isn't at home yet. Yesterday she didn't get back till 11 either. What of it? She says she's at a girlfriend's, but it makes me anxious. She says that Micah's father has a permit to use his car at night, and that he drives her right to the corner. Why worry then? Said Victor. At the same time he thought to himself, good God, we're talking about a real success, about a Stalin Prize, and she has to bring up trivia like this. 2 days after the meeting of the Scientific Council, Victor phoned Shishakov at home. He wanted to ask him to accept the young physicist Landesman on the staff. The personnel department were dragging their feet. At the same time, he wanted to ask Shishakov to speed up the formalities for Anna Naumovna Weisspapier's return from Kazan. Now that the institute was recruiting again, it was ridiculous to leave qualified staff behind in Kazan. All this had been on Victor's mind for a long time, but he had been afraid that Shishakov was not well disposed towards him, and would just say, "Have a word with my deputy." As a result, he kept postponing the conversation. But today he was riding the wave of his success. 10 days ago he had felt awkward about visiting Shishakov at work. Now it seemed quite simple and natural to phone him at home. "Who's speaking?" a woman's voice answered. Victor was pleased by the way he announced his name. He sounded so calm and unhurried. The woman paused for a moment and then said in a friendly voice, "Oh, just a minute." A minute later, in the same kindly voice, she said, "Please phone him tomorrow morning at the Institute at 10 o'clock. "Oh, thank you. I'm sorry for troubling you." Victor felt a burning embarrassment spread over his skin and through every cell of his body. He thought wearily that this feeling would stay with him even while he slept. When he woke up in the morning, he'd think, "Why do I feel so awful?" And then he'd remember, "Oh yes, that stupid telephone call." He went to Lyudmila's room and told her about his attempt to speak to Shishakov. "Yes," said Lyudmila, "you certainly have got off on the wrong foot, as your mother used to say about me." Victor began to curse the woman who had answered the phone. "To hell with the bitch. I hate the way of asking who's speaking and then saying that the boss is busy." Lyudmila usually shared Victor's indignation at incidents like this, and that was why he'd come to talk to her. "Do you remember," said Victor, "I had thought that Shishakov was so distant because he couldn't get any credit for himself out of my work. Now he's realized that there is a way, by discrediting me. He knows that Sadko doesn't love me." "God, you are suspicious," said Lyudmila. "What time is it?" 9:15. "You see, Nadia's still out." "God, you are suspicious," said Victor. "By the way," said Lyudmila, "I heard something at the store today. Apparently Svetchin's been nominated for a prize too." "Well, I like that. He never said a word about it. What for, anyway?" "For his theory of diffusion." "That's impossible. It was published before the war." "You wait. He'll be the one who wins it. And you're doing all you can to help him." "Oh, don't be a fool, Lyuda." "You need your mother. She'd have said what you wanted to hear." "What are you so angry about?" "I wish you'd shown my mother a fraction of the warmth I've always felt for Alexandra Vladimirovna." "Anna Semyonovna never loved Tolya," said Lyudmila. "That's not true," said Victor. His wife had become a stranger. He found her obstinacy and her unfairness quite frightening. In the morning, Victor had news from Sokolov. Shishakov had invited some of the institution's staff round to his home the previous evening. Kovchenko had come to fetch Sokolov in his car. One of the guests had been young Badin, a head of the scientific section of the Central Committee. Victor felt even more mortified. He must have rung Shishakov when his guests were already there. He gave a little smile and said, "So Count Saint-Germain is one of the guests. And what did the gentleman discuss?" He suddenly remembered the velvet tone of the voice he'd used to give his name. He'd been certain that Shishakov would come running delightedly to the phone as soon as he had heard the name Strum. He groaned. and then thought that only a dog could have groaned so pitifully, a dog scratching at a particularly annoying flea. "I must say," said Sokolov, "you'd never have thought it was wartime. Coffee? Dry Georgian wine? Not many people at all, less than a dozen." "How strange," said Victor. Sokolov understood the meaning of his thoughtful tone of voice. "Yes, I don't really understand," he said equally thoughtfully. "Or rather, I don't understand at all." "Was Gurevitch there?" "No, they phoned him, but he had a session with some of the postgraduates." Yes, said Victor, drumming one finger on the table. Then, to his surprise, he heard himself asking, "Pyotr Laventryevitch, was anything said about my work?" Sokolov hesitated for a moment. "I get the feeling, Victor Pavlovitch, that people who sing your praises so unreservedly are doing you a disservice. It upsets the authorities." "Yes," said Victor. "Go on, finish what you're saying." Sokolov said that Gavronov had asserted that Victor's work contradicted the Leninist view of the nature of matter. "Well," said Victor, "what of it?" "Well, Gavronov doesn't matter." "You know that, but what does matter is that Badin supported him. His line seemed to be that for all its brilliance, your work contradicts the guidelines laid down at that famous meeting." He glanced at the door, then at the telephone, and said very quietly, "You know, I'm afraid our bosses are going to pick you as a scapegoat in a campaign to strengthen party spirit in science. You know what that sort of campaign's like? They choose a victim and then crush him. It would be terrible, and your work's so remarkable, so unique." "And so no one stood up for me?" "I don't think so." "And you, Pyotr Lamtrevich?" "There seemed no point in arguing. One can't refute that kind of demagogy." Victor sensed his friend's embarrassment and began to feel embarrassed himself. No, of course not. You're quite right." They fell into an uncomfortable silence. Victor felt a shiver of fear, the fear that was always lurking in his heart, fear of the state's anger, fear of being a victim of this anger that could crush a man and grind him to dust. "Yes," he said pensively, "it's no good being famous when you're dead." "How I wish you understood that," said Sokolov quietly. "Pyotr Laventryevitch," asked Victor in the same hushed voice, "how's Madyarov? Is he all right? Have you heard from him? Sometimes I get very anxious, I don't know why." His question, unprompted and spoken near a whisper, was a way of saying that some relationships are special and have nothing to do with the state. "No, I've no news from Kazan at all." Sokolov's reply, delivered in a loud, unruffled voice, was a way of saying that such a relationship was no longer appropriate for them. Then Markov and Sevastyanov came into the office, and the topic of conversation changed. Markov was citing examples of women who had poisoned their husbands' lives. "Everyone gets the wife he deserves," said Sokolov. He looked at his watch and left the room. Sevastyanov laughed and called after him, "If there's one seat in a trolleybus, then Maria Ivanovna stands and Pyotr Laventryevitch sits. If the doorbell rings during the night, he stays in bed and Mashenka rushes out, in her dressing gown, to find out who's there. No wonder he thinks a wife's a man's best friend." "I wish I was as lucky," said Markov. "My wife just says, 'What's the matter with you? Have you gone deaf or something? Open the door.'" Feeling suddenly angry, Victor said, "What are you talking about? Pyotr Laventryevitch is a model husband." "You've no reason to complain, Vyacheslav Ivanovitch," said Sevastyanov. "You're in your laboratory day and night. You're well out of range." "And do you think I don't have to pay for that?" asked Markov. "I see," said Sevastyanov, savouring a new witticism. "Stay at home, as they say. My home is my Peter and Paul fortress." Victor and Markov burst out laughing. Obviously afraid that there might be more of these jokes, Markov got up and said to himself, "Vyacheslav Ivanovitch, it's time you were back at work." When he had gone, Victor said, "And he used to be so prim, so controlled in all his movements. Now he's like a drunkard. He really is in his laboratory day and night." Yes, said Sevastyanov. He's like a bird building a nest. He's totally engrossed. And he's even stopped gossiping, laughed Victor. A bird building a nest. Yes, I like that. Very abruptly, Sevastyanov turned to face Victor. There was a serious look on his young face. By the way, he said, there's something I must tell you. Victor Pavlovitch, Shishkov's evening, to which you weren't invited, was absolutely appalling. It quite shocked me. Victor frowned. He felt humiliated by this expression of sympathy. All right, leave it at that, he said dryly. Victor Pavlovitch, Sevastyanov went on, I know you don't care whether you were invited or not, but has Pyotr Laventrovich told you the filth Gavronov came out with? He said your work stinks of Judaism, and that Gurevitch only called it a classic because you are a Jew, and the authorities just gave a quiet smile of approval. That's the Slav Brotherhood for you. Instead of going to the canteen at lunchtime, Victor paced up and down his office. Who would have thought people could stoop so low? Good for Sevastyanov, anyway, and he seemed so empty and frivolous with his endless jokes and his photos of girls in swimming costumes. Anyway, it was all nonsense. Gavronov's blatherings didn't matter. He was just a petty, envious psychopath, and if no one had replied, it was because what he'd said was patently absurd. All the same, he was upset and worried by this nonsense. How could Shishakov not invite him? It was really very rude and stupid of him. What made it worse was that Victor didn't give a damn for that fool Shishakov and his evenings, and yet he was upset as if he'd been struck by some irreparable tragedy. He knew he was being foolish, but he couldn't help it. And he'd wanted to be given one more egg than Sokolov. Well, well. But there was one thing that hurt him deeply. He wanted to say to Sokolov, Aren't you ashamed of yourself, my friend? Why didn't you tell me how Gavronov slandered me? That's twice you've kept silent, once then and once with me. He was very distressed indeed. But this didn't stop him from saying to himself, Yes, but who's talking? You didn't tell your friend Sokolov about Karimov's suspicions of Madyarov, a relative of his. You kept your mouth shut too. Out of embarrassment? Tact? Nonsense. Out of cowardice. Jewish cowardice. It was obviously one of those days. Next, Anna Stepanovna Loshakova came into his office looking very upset. Surely she hasn't heard of my troubles already, thought Victor. What's the matter, my dear Anna Stepanovna? What is all this, Victor Pavlovitch? She began. Acting like that behind my back. What have I done to deserve it? During the lunch break, Anna Stepanovna had been told to go to the personnel department. There she had been asked to write a letter of resignation. The director had ordered them to dismiss any laboratory assistant without further education. I've never heard such nonsense, said Victor. Don't worry, I'll sort it out for you. Anna Stepanovna had been particularly hurt when Dubyankov had said that the administration had nothing against her personally. Well, what could they have against me, Victor Pavlovitch? Oh, God, forgive me. I'm interrupting your work. Victor threw a coat over his shoulders and walked across the courtyard to the 2-story building that housed the personnel department. Very well, he said to himself. Very well. He didn't articulate his thoughts any further. This very well had many meanings. Dubyankov greeted Victor and said, I was just about to phone you. About Anna Stepanovna. Oh, what makes you think that? No, what I wanted to say is that in view of various circumstances, senior members of staff are being asked to fill in this questionnaire here. Victor looked at the sheaf of papers. Oh, it looks as though it'll keep me busy for a week. Oh, nonsense, Victor Pavlovitch. Just one thing, though. In the event of a negative answer, rather than putting a dash, you must write out in full, no, I have not, no, I was not, no, I do not, and so on. Listen, my friend, said Victor, it's quite absurd to be dismissing our senior laboratory assistant, Anna Stepanovna Loshakova. I want that order cancelled. Loshakova, repeated Dubyankov. But Victor Pavlovitch, how can I cancel an order that comes from the director himself? But it's mad, said Victor. She saved the institute. She looked after everything during the bombing, and now she's being dismissed on purely administrative grounds. Members of staff are never dismissed from the institute without administrative grounds, said Dubyankov pompously. Anna Stepanovna is not only a wonderful person, she's one of the finest workers in our laboratory. If she really is irreplaceable, said Dubyankov, then you must speak to Kazyan Terentievich. By the way, there are 2 other points concerning your laboratory that have to be settled. Dubyankov held out 2 sheets of paper that had been stapled together. This is about the nomination for the position of research assistant of... He looked down at the paper and read out very slowly, Landesman Emily Pinkuzovich. Yes, said Victor, recognized the paper in Dubyankov's hands. I wrote that. And this is Kazyan Tenterevich's decision, lacking the necessary qualifications. What on earth do you mean? He's got perfect qualifications. How's Kovchenko to know who I need? Well, then you'll have to discuss that with Kazyan Terenteyevich too, said Dubyankov. And this is a statement made by our members of staff still in Kazan, together with your petition. Yes. Kazyan Terenteyevich considers it inappropriate for them to return now, since they're working productively at Kazan University. The matter will be reviewed at the end of the academic year. Dubyankov spoke very quietly and softly, as though he wanted to tone down this bad news. His face, however, expressed only inquisitiveness and ill will. Well, thank you, comrade Dubyankov, said Victor. For a second time, Victor walked across the yard, repeating to himself, very well, very well. No, he didn't need the authorities' support, his friend's affection, or his wife's understanding. He could fight on alone. He went up to the first floor of the main building. The secretary announced him, and Kovchenko, in a black jacket and embroidered Ukrainian shirt, came out of his office. Welcome, Victor Pavlovich. Come through into my hut. Victor went in. It was furnished with red sofas and armchairs. Kovchenko motioned Victor towards one of the sofas and sat down beside him. Kovchenko smiled as he listened to Victor. His apparent friendliness was very like Dubyankov's, and no doubt he had given a similar smile when Gavronov had spoken about Victor's work. But what can we do? Kovchenko gestured helplessly. We didn't think this up ourselves. She stayed there during the bombing, you say. That can't be considered of especial merit now, Victor Pavlovich. Every Soviet citizen will put up with bombing if that's what this country orders. He thought for a moment, then said, There is one possibility, however, though it will attract criticism. We can give Loshakova the position of junior assistant, and she can keep her card for the special store. Yes, that I can promise you. No, said Victor, that would be insulting. Victor Pavlovich, are you saying that the Soviet state should be governed by one set of laws, and Strum's laboratory by another? No, I'm simply asking for Soviet law to be applied. According to Soviet law, Loshakova cannot be dismissed. And while we're on the subject of law, Kazyan Terenteyevich, Victor went on, why did you refuse to confirm the appointment of young Landesman? He's extremely talented. Kovchenko bit his lip. Victor Pavlovich, he may have the abilities you require, but you must understand that there are other circumstances to be considered by the Institute. Very good, said Victor. I see. Then he asked in a whisper, The questionnaire, I suppose. Has he got relatives abroad? Kovchenko shrugged his shoulders. Kazyan Terenteyevich, said Victor, let me continue this very pleasant conversation. Why are you delaying the return from Kazan of my colleague, Anna Naumovna Weiss-Papier? She has, incidentally, completed a thesis. What contradiction are you going to find now between my laboratory and the state? A martyred expression appeared on Kovchenko's face. Victor Pavlovich, why this interrogation? Please understand that choice of personnel is my responsibility. Very good, said Victor. I see. He knew he was about to get extremely rude. With all due respect, Kazyan Terentievich, he went on, I just can't go on like this. Science isn't at Dubionkov's beck and call, or yours. I'm here for my work, not just to serve the obscure interests of the personnel department. I shall write to Alexei Alexeyevich Shishakov. He can put Dubionkov in charge of the nuclear laboratory. Calm down, Viktor Pavlovich. Please calm down. No, I can't go on like this. Viktor Pavlovich, you've no idea how much the Institute values your work, and no one values it more than I do. What do I care how much you value my work? Viktor looked at Kovchenko's face. Rather than humiliation, however, he saw in it an expression of eager pleasure. Viktor Pavlovich, there's no question of your being allowed to leave the Institute, Kovchenko said sternly, and that's not because you're indispensable. Do you really think that no one can replace Viktor Pavlovich Strum? His final words were spoken almost tenderly. You can't do without Landesmann and Vice Papier, and you think there's no one in all of Russia who can replace you? He looked at Viktor. Viktor felt that at any moment Kovchenko might come out with the words that had been hovering between them all along, brushing against his eyes, hands, and brain like an invisible mist. He bowed his head. He was no longer a professor, a doctor of science, a famous scientist who had made a remarkable discovery, a man who could be forthright and independent, arrogant and condescending. He was just a man with curly hair and a hooked nose, with a stooped back and narrow shoulders, screwing up his eyes as though he was expecting a blow to the cheek. He looked at the man in the embroidered Ukrainian shirt and waited. Very quietly, Kovchenko said, Calm down, Viktor Pavlovich. Calm down. You really must calm down. Heavens, what a fuss over such a trifle.